investigate. To do so, Fanny Hajina has been constantly going back and forth between her hives and her lab.
Εμείς σαν επιστήμονες, μαζί με τους μελισσοκόμους, έπρεπε να βρούμε τη λύση.
But looking for the truth has proven to be a game of cat and mouse. The usual task for scientists is to retreat into the calm of their labs, then explain what's being observed on the ground. We ask them to shed light on the mystery of the dying bees, just as they have explained so many other phenomena. The role of science is to highlight natural mechanisms and reach an explanation for the slightest observable fact. This is how science normally progresses, by solving more and more mysteries. And in principle, our knowledge of the world we live in increases. However, this fine principle sometimes has a few hiccups. For scientific observers, the case of the vanishing bees is emblematic of this.
With something like bees and pesticides, you should have been able to investigate it by collecting data, by following the evidence where it's taking you.
The crux of the idea is that when we find the evidence that tells us what's happening, we tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and we let the chips fall where they may. We commit, in a way, sort of, committing to accepting the truth of those findings.
But in the case of the bees, that's not exactly how things went. In the early 2000s, government expert reports showed the toxic effect of even very low doses of neonicotinoids on bees. And yet, for more than 20 years, there has been no unanimity, no consensus on the link between these pesticides and the disappearance of bees. Why are things lagging so much? You need to be a very shrewd observer to see the whole picture.
À partir du moment où on a vu ces troubles des abeilles apparaître, il y a eu peut-être 4 à 5 fois plus de recherches sur les causes alternatives aux pesticides, les pathogènes naturels, le varroa, nosema, différents virus, mais aussi sur les mauvaises pratiques apicoles, le changement climatique, la perte d'habitat, l'éclairage nocturne, le frelon asiatique, d'autres espèces invasives, le petit coléoptère de la ruche. Bref, il y a eu toute une variété de causes alternatives qui a été plus intensément explorée, on va dire, que les pesticides.
A quick search in a scientific study database proves it. As soon as pesticides were suspected, the number of public or private studies focusing on other possibilities skyrocketed. 2010, the veterinary authorities were confused.
Il n'y a pas de conclusion, ni dans un sens ni dans l'autre, on ne peut pas conclure. Je ne peux pas le faire. Et je pense que personne aujourd'hui ne peut le faire.
The more studies there were, the less beekeepers could make sense of it all. It seems like a paradox until you look back to an older case.
When you see a flourishing of new studies emerge in any particular area, a little bit ironically, it creates the appearance of being dedicated to pursuing the truth. But it takes me directly back to the case of big tobacco.
It's what's up front that counts. And up front ahead of the filter.
To understand, we need to go back to the 1950s, a time when tobacco was treated with total recklessness.
Filter blend means fine tobacco for the best taste, yes, that's why.
But this recklessness wouldn't last.
What does this product contain? Scientists suspect that...
In December 1953, the bad news broke. Researchers had just provoked cancer in mice by painting them with tar from cigarettes. After this discovery, war broke out.
The tobacco companies had a real crisis because they can't contest the evidence and say it's wrong. They can just say, we don't know. And so the leaders of all the major cigarette companies got together in New York City.
We now know that a meeting took place at the Plaza Hotel in New York in December between the bosses of the 7 major manufacturers, collectively known as Big Tobacco. Imagine the scene.
Gentlemen, let's get back to the heart of the matter.
The meeting would go down in the annals of ignorance.
mistaken. Yes.
The press published the declaration. Tobacco industry to start scientific research.
Believe me, friends, Chesterfield has for your smoking pleasure and protection every advantage known to modern science. Chesterfield gives you scientific facts.
La mise en place d'un centre de recherche sur le tabac, elle vise pas uniquement à produire du savoir, mais surtout à produire du savoir qui va à l'encontre de d'autres faits établis. Donc, on utilise la méthode scientifique contre la science établie.
It's really using science against itself.
The explicit use of science against science, I think, does represent a kind of watershed. To systematically fund scientific research in order to undermine science, effectively fighting fire with fire, that's a watershed moment.
So after they decided this, how did they operationalize it? One of the things that tobacco companies funded a lot of is what I call distracted research.
The labs backed by the cigarette manufacturers defined research projects known as special projects, or SPs, a whole arsenal for diverting science. They researched, for example, lung cancer in non-smokers. They searched for links to habitat, working conditions, personal habits. They experimented on rabbits to see if lung cancer could be caused by toxins or viruses. Big Tobacco thus generously financed hundreds of research projects. Some of these projects turned out to be very useful, such as research into the precursors of cardiovascular disease. But others were totally wacky. Can egg yolk or tomato juice on the skin lead to tumors? What's the link between lung cancer and baldness? Or between the same cancer and the month of birth? If you were born in March, claimed one study, you were more at risk.
Il faut dire, il y a plein de causes à tout. On ne peut pas établir la cause. Le plus c'est de dire qu'on ne peut pas établir la cause. C'est de semer de l'ignorance en noyant le poisson dans une multiplication de données.
A convincing strategy, because lung cancer can probably be explained by a combination of factors. Identifying the different risk factors is normal in science. Multiplying avenues of research seems totally legitimate. But it can also be extremely handy for sowing confusion. It becomes almost impossible to prove the suspect's guilt, and that's the aim.
That's extremely well understood, and that designed playbook for pretty much every other science denial that has followed.
This is a story about tobacco. This is a story about acid rain. This is a story about the ozone hole. This is a story about pesticides. This is a story about climate change. Neonicotinoids, bisphenol A, contraceptive pills. I mean, we have now seen this strategy used over and over and over again. It's about buying time.
Et c'est malheureusement une stratégie gagnante.
In the case of tobacco, it's 70 years already and it's still going.
Right now, there are 2 billion people who are overweight or obese. It's profitable to sell food that is fatty and sugary and salty and addictive.
It's not at the individual level. It's not individual willpower. And if we go on believing that, we'll never change this obesity epidemic.
That industry has been influencing very deeply the medical and scientific establishment.
So what's driving the obesity epidemic? It's corporate profit.
In the case of the dying bees, the advancement of knowledge has also been deliberately slowed down.
Πιστεύω
senior scientists, their senior lawyers, their senior management, their senior public relations people, talking very, very frankly about what they knew about the dangers of smoking.
This was an unhoped-for treasure for the professor.
It's like a new world, stumbling into a new world.
The leaked documents increased in number. The truth broke. The tobacco industry bosses were cornered.
Exposure of documents have shaken my confidence that your companies care about the truth. These documents suggest possible manipulation
can find such a substance here, can it be elsewhere? In toys, bottles, food containers, in all the plastics that end up in the environment. And how does it affect our organism?
Toute la question, c'est d'établir les doses auxquelles le public peut être exposé sans risque majeur pour sa santé. Et cette question-là, c'est vraiment la mère de toutes les batailles.
The effect of product X on health is what is studied by toxicologists. The accepted rule is centuries old. It's simple and seemingly makes good sense. The effect is proportionate to the quantity absorbed. It's true for sugar. It's true for fats. It's true for pretty much any product. According to the rules of toxicology, the dose makes the poison, which by extension means that anything below the dose isn't a poison. According to this rule, a plastic with the characteristics of a hormone that ends up in a baby's mouth shouldn't pose any problem, because the quantity of synthetic estrogen ingested is tiny. True or false? This is the crux of the battle.
Il y a une expérience que va conduire un chercheur américain à l'université de Missouri qui s'appelle Fred Von Saal et qui va être la première expérience contrôlée sur les animaux de laboratoire pour essayer d'évaluer l'activité d'un plastifiant très banal qui s'appelle le bisphénol A.
This has the structure of an estrogenic drug. They are using a sex
alleged torture of 14 suspects IRA members by the British soldiers, and one of them told us what he had to endure.
With this constant white noise that came in and took over your brain, we were denied sleep. We also were denied use of toilet. That was constant for the 7 days.
Arizona law enforcement struggles to deal with hundreds of migrants arriving every day. Officials are rounding on the Biden administration, with sheriffs describing the situation as chaos.
So we end up with the deaths in the desert, the robberies that are happening along the border, the pursuits, then the ancillary criminal activity like the large amounts of drugs that are being smuggled into our country.
Live from Moscow, thanks for joining us tonight on RT International. I'm Daniel Hawkins. Wherever you are this hour, welcome to the programme. The UK has recorded a record COVID surge with more than 93,000 cases registered in the past 24 hours. The Mayor of London has declared a major incident with hospitals running out of capacity. Meanwhile, the government's ramping up its restrictions, sparking a furious response on the streets of the capital. Thousands of people are now marching in the capital, and there's a heavy police presence. They're outraged over reported plans for mandatory vaccines, as well as all the new COVID pass system. Under the rules, adults in England have to show an immunity pass to enter nightclubs, sports venues and other large events. While there's similar pictures playing out across Europe as the spread of the Omicron variant accelerates, RT's Peter Oliver reports now from the German capital.
Well, the fourth wave of COVID-19 certainly isn't over, and while we're still dealing with that, the new German Health Minister Karl Lauterbach has been painting a pretty bleak picture about the immediate future. He was looking at the number of infections of the Omicron variant in the United Kingdom and saying that there is potentially a massive wave of the virus on its way.
I'm assuming there will be a massive fifth wave. I'm in close contact with my colleagues from the UK, both politically and scientifically. We were still coordinating just yesterday. My colleagues say that what has been observed there on the ground exceeds anything that has been observed in the entire pandemic. We have to prepare ourselves for a challenge that we have not faced yet in this form.
While infection numbers have been dropping gradually in recent days and weeks here in Germany, it isn't happening fast enough, according to the country's public health authority, the Robert Koch Institute, in order to release the burden from intensive care beds and the availability of those intensive care beds. It's not just in Germany where there are problems on the horizon to new action being taken. In Switzerland, they've brought in new measures which are designed in order to, well, get more people to get vaccinated, basically. If you haven't been vaccinated or can't prove that you have recovered from COVID within the last 6 months, you're going to be pretty much barred from everywhere in Switzerland from here on out. What we're seeing is you're going to need to provide the proof of one of those two things to get into sports stadiums, cultural events and leisure facilities, also restaurants as well. It comes after the intensive care unit bed space, or the capacity for that bed space in Switzerland, passed 82% this week. So the country deciding to take emergency measures there. In Denmark, they've also implemented new measures. They are going to be closing theatres and cinemas because of a rise of COVID cases there. In France, what they've done is they've basically cut off all non-essential travel between France and the United Kingdom because of the sheer number of cases, tens of thousands, huge amounts of COVID cases being recorded in the United Kingdom. France deciding they want as few people as possible travelling between their two countries. It's also prompted action at an EU level. Member states and their leaders saying that they wanted to see more vaccines that are specifically tailored to tackle the Omicron variant of COVID-19. In fact, the orders are all ready to go in for 180 million doses of COVID vaccines that would target specifically the Omicron variant. When we're on the subject of vaccines, there's been a massive push here in Germany to get people to come forward for booster jabs. In fact, 1.5 million people were vaccinated here in Germany on Wednesday alone. 1.3 million of those were booster vaccines. But the problem is there's not enough
person to person. Until we vaccinate properly around the world, we are making it possible for new variants to arise.
The UK Supreme Court has ruled it was illegal for police to drop a probe into alleged torture committed by British soldiers in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. The case relates to the Troubles, when hundreds of suspected IRA members were detained, often without charge. 14 of those arrested were subjected to brutal interrogation techniques. These were later recognised as illegal. Francis McGuigan, one of those 14, told us what he went through.
I was hooded, forced to stand against the wall, fingertips and tiptoes, small my back pushed in, so my body was actually bowed. With this constant white noise that came in and took over your brain, we were denied sleep. We also were denied use of toilet. They removed my own clothes and put me in a boiler suit. That boiler suit was my day clothes, my night clothes, and my toilet for 7 days. And that just went on. And when you're forced to stand against this wall with your fingertips and that in a stress position, your body can only stand so much and you collapse down, at which stage you were just beaten, taken back up against the wall. And that was constant for the 7 days. I finished up with 3 broken ribs. I still have nightmares. I don't know how many different psychiatrists I've spoken to, and the majority of them tell me I've been suffering that long that they don't think it'll ever go away.
Earlier, the UK announced plans to introduce limitations that would block prosecutions into alleged crimes related to Northern Ireland.
There are many members of the armed services who continue to face the threat of vexatious prosecutions well into their 70s and 80s and later. And we are finally, Mr. Speaker, bringing forward a solution to this problem, to enable the province of Northern Ireland to draw a line under the Troubles, to enable the people of Northern Ireland to move forward.
Well, the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights wrote a letter saying the UK was denying justice. However, the European Court for Human Rights ruled back in 1978 the 14 men's cases did not amount to torture. Well, that decision was later used by the Bush administration to justify enhanced interrogation techniques used at Bagram and Guantanamo. The ECHR rejected a 2018 bid to overturn its ruling. Francis McGuigan again says that he and others won't stop fighting to get justice.
An apology to the British government means nothing to me. I think the world, and its mother now acknowledges the fact of what happened to us. The same as what happened in Guantanamo, black sites. There's no investigation, so nobody was ever brought to heel for it. Boris now, and his way of shutting down the legacies, closing it all down, and this thing about protecting soldiers and this poor 70-year-old soldiers being dragged through the courts, I personally don't believe it has anything whatsoever to do with soldiers. We won every case in court. We've never lost a case in court, and we're no further forward today than we are. British policy, just stall it, delay it, stall it, delay it, stall it, delay it, push it back, push it back, push it back. Maybe they'll all forget about it, maybe they'll go away. We ain't going away. So we're not stopping. We're never going to stop on it. As I say, our children and our grandchildren will fight this out.
Arizona law enforcement say they're overwhelmed as hundreds of illegal migrants are crossing the border wall in Yuma each day. Earlier, the county's mayor imposed a state of emergency to secure additional resources for dealing with the inflow of people. Local sheriffs have described the situation as chaos. Caleb Morgan explains how it's got to this point.
The Arizona-Mexico border is buzzing with activity. 3,000 migrants crossed just this weekend, and the local sheriff says they are in a hurry.
There were a lot of people who were planning to come here, but because of this new law, they decided to come as soon as possible.
Now, the Biden administration recently reinstated the Trump administration's policy of having asylum seekers remain in Mexico, waiting in Mexico while their claims are considered. Now, the sheriff migration wave.
So the border is obviously a disaster. Well, actually, the Biden administration puts people on planes and flies them into Florida in the wee hours of the morning. So they've done over 70 flights in the last 6 months.
Now, Kamala Harris, who was vice president and just recently named as border czar by Joe Biden, doesn't seem to really be on the case. The Guatemalan head of state says he hasn't heard from her since June, despite White House reassurances.
Why is it that she has not spoken to the president of Guatemala since June? That's 6 months.
Well, I know that I did see this kind of strange report from the president of Guatemala saying that he's had no contact with the White House, which is inaccurate.
Other than your meeting with Harris in June, this is the only one. This is the only communication you've had with the Biden administration concerning illegal immigration?
Yet, Kamala Harris is currently touting her program with private companies to bring foreign investment to Central America and stop the migrant flow. But how much a trickle of funds from Pepsi, Cargill, and MasterCard will actually do remains unclear. Meanwhile, 50,000 juveniles seeking asylum have disappeared, according to the country's top migration tracker.
When compared case by case, record by record, with the previous month's data dump track received, we find that records just disappear without explanation. Track has repeatedly reached out to the agency, Executive Office of Immigration Review, the DOJ agency that oversees U.S. immigration cases, but has not received any satisfactory explanation. A number of these asylum cases continue to disappear each month.
Researchers say the U.S. Department of Justice is making it more difficult to track juvenile migrant cases, providing information that is not useful or precise. But one sheriff will not keep silent.
They've already got, over 147,000 juveniles that are out of country. They need to change the messaging, obviously. When you sit there and say that you're going to give individuals money because they were separated at the border, that's just a draw for the cartels and for the criminal element to exploit. So now that's why we see a number of juveniles coming across first, and then the parents come later because they know that they will be reunited. So it's all a play on the rules that this administration has put into place.
The migrant crisis has hung over the Biden administration from the beginning. Many wonder if there are any real solutions in the works, not just reassuring words. Caleb Maupin, RT, New York.
Still to come, electricity costs soar in Europe after France shuts down 4 nuclear reactors, while Russia looks east after being snubbed by the EU over energy. That story after a short break.
So what we've got to do is identify the threats that we have.
It's crazy.
Confrontation, let it be an arms race.
This affects very dramatic development.
I personally am going to resist.
I don't see how that strategy will be successful.
Very critical time. Time to sit down and talk.
Join me every Thursday on the Alex Salmon Show, and I'll be speaking to guests from the world of politics, sport, business, and show business. I'll see you there.
Failure to allow bond markets to reflect true market forces has resulted in a bifurcation in the economy where the most corrupt are rewarded for committing crimes. JP Morgan being a prime example. And if you have morals or ethics, you're penalized. If you're not out there stealing and looting, then you're going to be homeless. And that's America today. It's just sad.
Welcome back. Our brand new German sister channel, RTDE, has been accused of not having the necessary documentation to broadcast in Germany. RT Management's responded, saying its license was obtained in accordance with all European laws and regulations. Well, let's look at some context here. The new channel was taken off YouTube the very day it was launched. Technically, there's no connection between that and the German TV broadcast dispute. But as you can see, it's been a rocky start for RTDE. An official for the European Media Watchdog had some ominous words for the new channel.
The license must be issued in Germany, and the application must also be filed here. First of all, this is a real irritant, and we will take care of it.
He called RTD essentially a pesky little nuisance that is going to be taken care of. So that is some interesting language there right off the bat. But the crux of the issue is that, in his view, we have no business broadcasting in Germany. He is claiming incorrectly that the RTD news channel is actually based in Berlin, when in fact it is based in Moscow, quite literally down the hall from this studio, and the news programs are coming out here, being filmed here, edited, put on the air, and so forth. And they're doing that via a license through another country, Serbia, through another European license, and are in full right to broadcast across all of Europe, including in Germany. Our license was obtained under what is known as the European Convention on Transfrontier Television, which under that convention gives us the right to broadcast to 33 countries across Europe, as long as you broadcast from Moscow. And those countries include Germany, but they also include other countries with majority or significant German language populations, such as Austria, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and so forth. This is where this separation is really important. The legal action is being launched against RTDE Productions, which makes some of the shows. RTDE Productions does not need a license because RTDE Production is not a channel. A channel is RTDE that is coming out of here, and thus Moscow, our headquarters, our parent company, applied for that license in Serbia. The amount of pressure that our new German channel has faced even before it went on the air, difficulties with banks, difficulties not just with licensing, but the pressure on our guests and so forth, has been really unprecedented. Pressure again, as you mentioned at the beginning, on our digital platforms. We are ready to keep fighting.
We spoke earlier with veteran TV reporter Jim Laurie. He explained why some Western powers view RTE as an irritant.
You can't separate what's happening with RTE, with Chinese television, with other broadcasters, from the political situation. The poor relations between Germany and Russia right now, the poor relations between the United States and Russia right now, the poor relations between the United States and China. All of this is linked. You have a situation where Western nations, the United States in particular, followed by the UK, and now followed by Germany, it appears simply do not have the wherewithal, the desire to welcome state-controlled news channels into their country. In my view, it's purely political. There is a sense, and I can only speak here in America to an extent, where RT has been sanctioned in the past by being labeled as something part of the Foreign Agent Regulation Act of 1938. You have the same application to Chinese television. You have a situation where the nations that do not have good relations with the United States or Germany get penalized. So you have a situation where these international channels become embroiled in the international politics of the day.
Europe's facing problems with its energy costs, including soaring electricity bills, which shot up even further this week after France's biggest power provider shut down 4 of its nuclear reactors. EDF says it's down to technical faults. Earlier, Rory Souchet discussed the situation with our correspondent, Saskia Taylor.
Well, Europe's energy crisis might be a hot topic, but certainly it does look like it's going to be a cold winter on the continent. Because while gas prices have spiked, gas itself is running low. And I'm talking dangerously record lows. In fact, European gas storage supplies haven't been this bad in a decade. On average across the bloc, they're only 74% full. That's down from 94% last year. And Germany in particular is on edge.
Since the coldest part of winter is still ahead, the relatively low gas reserves should be used carefully. If we keep withdrawing gas at the current rate, the level will be very low by February.
So no buffer, no real reserve that anyone can sort of dip into in these really tight times. And things do seem to be going from bad to worse, because state-owned Electricité de France, or EDF, announced that it will be shutting down 2 of its nuclear reactors because of safety reasons. Some pipes there apparently need repairing. On top of that, another 2 have paused work pending inspections. This is bad news, of course, not just for France, whose electricity is mostly nuclear generated. It's not just bad news for the nations that it exports to, for example, the UK, but it's also very nerve-wracking for the markets, which have already been on a total rollercoaster ride over the last couple of months. But of course, who has taken the biggest hit of all? People. I mean, I was absolutely shocked to read that Europeans will pay 900% more for natural gas in January 2022 than they did in January 2021. So I really think, looking at this picture now, it's not an exaggeration to say it's a pretty dire situation.
A lot of this Russian gas that goes into Europe, they didn't fill up their coffers during last summer. So they were, as you were saying, the gas levels were low, prices have gone up, but Russia is the one who's apparently taken the blame. And certainly in the UK media and the tabloids and the European media, they're blaming Russia for these high prices. It is a big supplier of gas to Europe, but how is Moscow reacting to all of this?
Well, you are right. Around 30% of Europe's natural gas comes from Russia. So you'd think then, given how desperate the situation is, that Brussels would know what side its bread is buttered on. But what does the EU do? Having failed to come to an agreement on how to handle and move forward in this ongoing crisis, at an hours-long summit, it basically turns around and accuses Moscow of using gas as a political weapon. So of course we know it's always good to have someone else to blame. The thing is Russia is fulfilling its contracts. And the problem is that it is unwilling to turn the taps on to overflow. Moscow says, well, we've got our own load shortages. Domestic demand is incredibly high because you and I very well know the winter here really just can't give you any more. So Moscow is looking at how the situation is also thinking generally about how frosty Brussels has been to Russia in recent times. And he's thinking, you know what, it wouldn't be a bad time to diversify our market and to look to cooperate with perhaps more friendly nations. So to that end, a new pipeline is actually on the cards.
In practical terms, it's a project for a gas pipeline from Russia to China via Mongolia. The work is progressing successfully. It could become a continuation of the Russian Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. The optimal route and length have already been determined. A feasibility study is being prepared, and I think it will be ready in the coming weeks.
So construction on that could start as early as 2024. In the meantime, what's happening? Europe's crisis is worsening. The global market is bracing itself. Meanwhile, Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is ready to go,
This energy price crisis may prevail longer if we make geopolitics an issue of these energy themes. We are living in Europe together with Russia, and I think it is high time to return to serious diplomatic approaches rather than have megaphone diplomacy, which rather feeds escalation. I think there has been a shift of interest in the fact that the Euro-Asia is growing fast, and the interest of net gas comes from Russia has increased, and thus Europe doesn't I think Russia turning more and more towards the east is extremely high, and it would put a risk on energy safety in the European Union moving forward.
At least 3 people have died after a section of a bridge collapsed in China's Hubei province. In this video shot by